Welcome to another episode of MBA Mike. I'm your host, Roshan Patel, and today we're going to talk to Dr. Alastair Dunne. Alastair is a medical doctor by profession. He has worked on the Emirati Genome Project in the Middle East as an immigration officer in New Zealand, and he has worked as a private doctor to a Russian oligarch on his yacht. He's interested in longevity, AI, health tech. Today we are going to talk about living beyond 100 years of age. A very warm welcome to you, Alastair, today.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Very excited.
Before we deep dive into some of the questions around living beyond 100, do you want to give the audience a brief background?
Yeah, for sure. As you sort of alluded to, my most recent role that I came to the MBA from was working in Abu Dhabi for a company called G42, which is an artificial intelligence and cloud computing company. I was specifically within their healthcare division, and they were doing a number of big data projects. So, for example, they did the Sinopharm phase 3 clinical trial, and they delivering the Emirati Genome Program. So one of the roles I had within that organization was as the product owner for the consumer product that they were looking to deliver alongside the Emirati Genome Program for the up to 1 million participants that they're looking at having in that. Initially, the reason why I moved to the UAE was for a related VIP project, which sort of ties into some of the topics you've already alluded to without going into too many details. It relates to emerging biotech and the longevity sector. Often people wonder how I ended up in that line of work, and that relates to the other sort of interesting point that you raised there around working for one of the Russian oligarchs as the doctor on his yacht. It was sort of a fortuitous thing. It happened a few years ago. I was working various locum GP jobs in New Zealand and Australia. And one day I was contacted by the locum agency saying that they had this unique opportunity working on this yacht. And what did I think about it? And I did what anyone would do and said, yes, put me down for that. Didn't hear anything for a month or two. And then next thing I knew, I was being interviewed and off to do seafarer training and then off to Europe to join the yacht crew. And it turned out when I got there, I discovered the link was that the service manager on the yacht was a New Zealander. Her cousin ran the locum agency that I worked for. That was how that introduction happened. So it's not an easily replicable path into that sort of industry, but that was how I ended up in that VIP sector, and then ultimately ended up in the UAE because of that as well. So that's sort of been my path from, I guess, standard routine general practice into the more weird and wonderful. Along the way, I've also done various sort of advisory roles for the New Zealand government, as you've alluded to, and also some industry governance, some industry leadership positions, on the board of the Medical Association, things like that as well. So I've always been someone that's kind of had an approach to medicine that is not strictly the clinical consulting route.
Right. Why MBA now, after all of that experience? It sounds like you must be in a position where you feel like there's quite a lot that you can do as a medical doctor that you've realized through your experiences. And with all of those options, why sort of take a step back, if you consider it a step back, but why go back into education if you've done quite a lot of education in your life as a doctor?
I mean, I wouldn't consider it a step back, maybe a step to the side, if anything. The initial sort of I guess almost roots of me considering the MBA started probably 5 years ago, where I was in full-time clinical practice in New Zealand. I was on the board of the Medical Association. I wasn't finding the day-to-day clinical practice as rewarding as what I might have hoped, because I wasn't feeling like I was having the impact that I could have. And I found that working in the more like healthcare leadership roles was providing more, it was more rewarding, basically. So I started looking for other ways to sort of approach a healthcare career and how to have that impact on a higher level that impacts more people than the face-to-face consultation, and started looking at various organizations that I could get into to go different directions. At the same time, I was looking at perhaps maybe I'll just go out on my own, start my own facility, start my own maybe chain of clinics that does things in a different way, the way that I thought that things should be done. And certainly I was encouraged to do that by a number of professional mentors and also friends who are in the entrepreneurship sphere who felt that if you want to do a business, just do a business. You don't need a piece of paper to allow you to do that. But there was always something that was holding me back. And I think that maybe psychologically that's a thing that comes from being in a very regulated industry like healthcare, that to take that step, you feel like you do need someone to tell you it's okay potentially. So that was part of the reason why I started looking at the MBA in the first place. It was either going to be an MBA or Masters in Public Health or something like that. And then these other opportunities kept coming up, and it kept being something I pushed back. I think in 2017 was the first time I bought the GMAT study handbooks, and then other things came up, other things went on in my life that meant that I didn't actually end up going down the route of sitting GMAT at that stage. And it wasn't until 2019 when I had a difference of opinion with the Russian Oligarch that I was working for, that I found myself looking for new opportunities in late 2019. And I was over here in the UK. I had a course that I was doing, and I was catching up with a friend who was at that stage studying at Oxford. And we're at the pub one night, and he said, have you considered that this might be the perfect time to do this MBA that you've talked about for the last few years? You've got a lot of loose ends at the moment. This would be a good time to consider doing this if you're going to do it. So again, I jumped on the website, ordered the GMAT study manuals, but this time I booked the test as well at the same time. So I had this deadline a few months in advance that just before Christmas 2019 I was going to be in Sydney doing this test. And from there it just sort of flowed. I ultimately I had decided for some of the other project work I was doing for the New Zealand government was that I would, if I could do it from anywhere, I might as well do it from a villa in Bali, right? So I relocated there for about a month or so, with the idea being that I'd study for the GMAT alongside that. It didn't quite pan out as I'd intended, but ultimately when I got to Sydney a couple of days before Christmas, sat the GMAT, I was happy that the score was going to be good enough for entry into the sort of programs that I was looking at applying to. So then spent the next couple of weeks frantically pulling together applications for Cambridge, Oxford and NCAD, and was over here in February 2020 to do the interviews, as people were saying to me, what do you make of this COVID thing? Do you think this is going to be a big thing? Like, where do you think that this is going to go? And of course, by the time I got back to New Zealand in mid-March, the borders were all shutting everywhere. I think I snuck back into New Zealand about 48 hours before the international border closed. So my journey into the MBA, it sort of took an unusual turn at that point, because it had the whole option of, do you defer a year, and who knows what the pandemic is going to look like at that stage? Do you go into a effectively online learning module when you ultimately want all the connections? That's what you're paying for, is the networking, right? And around this time when I'm tossing this up in my head, I got the approach from the UAE, and that just worked perfectly as a better option than doing the MBA at that stage. So I think it is easy to look at, especially what I've been doing in the last year and a half, 18 months or so, and question, at that stage you've broken out of the clinical environment, you're in very much a corporate environment, why are you going down the MBA route? But it was because it was sort of it had already been planned. And then ultimately, I was aware that it was becoming a now or never thing, that if I didn't do it, I wasn't going to do it. I'd always kind of wondered, after medical school, all my friends who were in non-medical careers or non-legal careers in particular, all ended up at these various schools, Oxford, Cambridge, Ivy League schools, doing their PhDs and all sorts of wacky things. And I'd always kind of wondered, could I go to one of those fancy schools? And this is almost like it would have been too much of a what if to not come and do this. It's a 1-year program. At the end of it, I think I'll have learned a lot of skills that maybe I could have just learned from watching YouTube videos. But I've met a lot of people that otherwise wouldn't have met. I've had a lot of experiences I would not have been able to have. And for that's where the value is for me. Yeah.
It sounds really exciting to do a GMAT in Bali, so whatever the outcome.
The GMAT was, so I did I intended to do the GMAT study in Bali. I did the actual exam in Sydney on the way back to New Zealand.
Right, yeah. I see. Okay. Would you say that was the most time-consuming part of the entire application, or compared to at least thinking about how you're going to write up your story and essays?
So because of some other work opportunities that came up at that time, another project I was involved with regarding refugee health in New Zealand, as I say, I didn't dedicate much time to the GMAT study, and that was reflected in my especially numerical mark. I got pulled through on the linguistic side of things, but yeah, so for me, actually, it was the rest of the application process what took the bulk of the time, but that wasn't through good planning. It should have probably been a bit more emphasis on the GMAT, I think. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. But yeah.
It doesn't matter anymore, yeah. What do you think are the main medical technologies that you feel are going to have the greatest impact in our lives, but the ones that most people don't know much about?
I would start this by saying that a lot has changed in the last 20 years in medical technology. And I mean, even in the last 10 years since I graduated medical school, things that were impossible 10 years ago are now not only possible, but very much plausible or actually happening. So if we think back 20 years ago when the first human genome was sequenced, the Human Genome Project, it cost $1 billion, right? It was a very expensive thing to do. And we've talked about this before. The cost of that has now come down to $1,000.
Yeah.
There are companies out there that reckon they can get it down to $10 in the next year or two. That is remarkable in terms of the speed of technological transformation with that. The idea that you're not just sequencing a small part of the genome anymore, but you can sequence the entire human genome. You can do it in both long read, which is where you're looking at really long segments. That's where you can pick up the really the sort of the base pair repeats and things that otherwise, when you're fragmenting the DNA for sequencing, you're going to miss the length of that repeat.
Yeah.
So you can do it in that long read, that's the newer technology, and the short read as well, the more traditional way for accuracy with the base pairs. It means that not only are we doing this for much cheaper than was possible 20 years ago, it's much better quality than what was available 20 years ago as well. That data is just one kind of starting point in the whole process of what we call multi-omics. So multi-omics is just, all of these things end with the word omics, so we put multi in front because there's many of them. Now, if you think through the process from turning DNA into a protein, there's a few other aspects going along the way, right? So we've got transcription of the mRNA. Everyone's obviously familiar with mRNA these days in light of the mRNA vaccines. But that process, as you know, is happening through the body constantly. That mRNA we can now sequence as well. And we call that the transcriptome. And that varies in different parts of the bodies, but it tells you which genes are actually active at any one point in time. That's an additional bit of data that we can do. That's very much an emerging field at this stage.
So that's like level 2
Yeah.
on top of the genome.
At the same time, you can also look at the epigenome, which is very much the on top of the genome. So the changes on top of the DNA in the way that it's folded and stored and everything like that, that may affect the way that it's read and transcribed. So the one that people most commonly know about is methylation. And you may have heard of methylation clocks and things like that to look at the aging process. It is one of the epigenetic changes. It's probably, as I say, the most well-known and most easily tested for. But again, that also uses the same sequencing technology that 20 years ago would not have been at all available. Now it's quite readily and increasingly readily available. So we've got the epigenome as well. So then we've got the metagenome. So everyone will have heard of the microbiome. You've got different microbiome in your gut, in different parts of your gut, on your skin, oral microbiome. Everywhere in the body has different microbiome. The metagenome is when you sequence the entire genetic material of everything in the microbiome. So all the bacteria, all the viruses, all the protozoa, the fungi, everything. Again, another massive trove of data that you can get on an individual.
Yeah. Just out of interest, is it possible to handle all of that data right now? So there's obviously going to be multiple number of bacteria and viruses in our body. Do we know what to do with that data?
No, we don't. And this sort of, I think we skip ahead to this point to talk about, because I think this is the really key aspect of this, is that in the past, doing something that generates a huge amount of data on a human, even not a huge amount, like if you go to a lab and order every single blood test that's possible on a person, some's going to come back out of range, everything like that. Traditional medicine will say, do not do that. You don't blindly go fishing for problems. You need to know what the problem is when you go look for it. Don't do blind MRI scans across full body, everything like that. Not indicated, not a good idea to do. And that's because traditionally we haven't always understood the way to correlate those findings in terms of how relevant they are to reality. This huge amount of data that you can generate through multiomics, it's only in this last few years or so that firstly data storage is keeping up with the play. So we're able to have these. I mean, when I had my whole genome sequenced at my previous employer, I think it was 15 gigabytes. If you're thinking you're doing that plus the metagenome, like 90% of the genetic material in your body is not human, it's microbial. So let's say that's 150 gigs. Like you generate, and you might want to do that frequently. You might want to do that every 6 weeks, 3 months or something. The amount of data you're generating is like unfathomable, or would have been unfathomable 20 years ago. Now it's sort of, okay, this is something we can do, we can store. Like, how do you process that? How do you know what these various bacteria mean, everything like that? Of course we don't know yet. But that's where artificial intelligence and machine learning starts coming in as well, being able to detect patterns that otherwise we would not detect as human beings. So we're at this sort of point in history where we're getting this confluence of multiple technologies that are coming of age at the same time, that mean that something like multiomics goes from being a scientific fiction concept 20 years ago to actually very realistically something that is probably going to be impacting day-to-day clinical practice within the next decade. Because it doesn't just stop at the metagenome. Ultimately, once the mRNA has been read, it gets turned into the proteins. So you can look at the proteome and see all the proteins. You can see the breakdown products of those, so the metabolome as well. Wide range of data that you can get from these various tests that all kind of rely on, to some extent, the underlying genetic sequencing technologies and other laboratory testing that's becoming increasingly available. And on the side of that, then you have other things like companies like Grail doing really interesting stuff with looking at DNA fragments to pick up cancers at a really early stage. Again, effectively, that's a genomic technology that they're using for that. So there's a huge amount that's happening in that sort of space. For the day-to-day average clinician, to be exposed to these things is quite difficult. They've got to keep up to date with the latest guidelines. They've got to treat the bloody pandemic. There's been so much going on that means that it's very difficult for, I think, for the average clinician to get a grasp of what is happening, not just in the multi-omics sphere, but also in the AI sphere, the big data sphere, and everything like that. And it's very easy to dismiss it all as voodoo or not scientific or whatever people want to criticize it as. The reality is the people working on this are the top medical schools, top universities, the top researchers in the world. So it is a very real thing, and it is happening.
So of course this on top of the fact that you have a queue of people who need primary care. As a clinician, do you treat those people or start looking at the future? I guess is what you're trying to say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing, is if you're a GP with a waiting room full of people, it's very difficult to think around. I mean, you could sit back over a couple of glasses of wine in the evening and say, hey, yeah, it would be wonderful if we had a system that was able to identify all medical conditions at a stage well before they actually caused any pathology. It was able to allow people to take lifestyle changes or whatever that would change the course of their health so they wouldn't ever develop those conditions that we're heading down the route of. All of these theoreticals we talk around with multi-omics, I don't think there'd be any primary care physician that wouldn't think that would be a great idea. But it doesn't change the fact that their waiting room is filled with people with chronic conditions now. So, I mean, I can see where that disconnect is in sort of society there. And it's very difficult to talk around building those sort of systems into the pre-existing healthcare model, healthcare delivery model, which is very much focused around service provision once people are sick. People always talk about it's not healthcare, it's sick care, rather than preventative approaches.
So identification is obviously one thing, but we need to treat it to get some actual benefit from genomics and multi-omics. Do you think that's not going to be too far away once we have learned how to identify conditions?
The diagnostics technology may be getting ahead of the therapeutics technology. There is a lot of amazing things happening in therapeutics. I mean, mRNA technology that's being used for those vaccines was not really intended for making infectious disease vaccines. It's more relating to any number of other conditions that you can treat with that, but in particular oncology sort of treatments. On top of that, you've got the possibility that AI allowing better understanding of protein folding and everything like that is going to speed up the process of drug development, and that full understanding of how a human works through multiomics is going to mean that you can better target medications to individuals and everything like that. The problem, I think, will come from some of these technologies is that it's the whole issue with screening in general. Like, do you really know that this is having a positive effect on people, or is it this sort of the lag effect that if you pick up someone's cancer 5 years earlier, then it appears that they survive 5 years longer, regardless of what you've done, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that is a reasonable criticism, and something we do need to keep in mind with these sort of technologies is, are they actually going to do anything major? But I do think that there are a number of conditions, especially a number of these more insidious cancers, so things like ovarian cancer, things like pancreatic cancer, that are seldom detected at the early stage that we want them to be detected at, that prior attempts at screening programs for these have not proven cost effective. But instead, if you had a really effective method of detecting these at a really early stage, you may be able to intervene well before there was any significant problems. The question, of course, is our treatments for cancer are very barbaric, really, aren't they? Like chopping things out, poisoning the body, frying it with radiation. Until we get to a stage where we're moving to these more immunologic treatments.
Targeted, yeah.
Exactly. Detecting a cancer at a stage where it is too small to actually do any harm to a person is not inherently going to be a good thing. Mm-hmm. So that's the issue that I think we'll see how things develop over time.
Yeah.
I think we're very much at a stage where we can probably expect in the next 5 to 10 years, at least in certain facilities, that multiomics, including the radiomics, the full body MRI, plus all of the the wearables technology and everything like that, it's going to come together to allow people to be diagnosed at a stage of conditions they never would have been previously. Will we immediately see a therapeutics benefit in that? That's too early to say, I would say, at this point.
So let's move on to the topic of longevity. For quite some time, I've noticed this has been a pursuit of the ultra-rich, the sort of typical billionaire that you can imagine doesn't have much to do in their time, so they invest a lot of time and resources into how to live a longer life, particularly how to live beyond 100 and not potentially be disabled at a certain age or have conditions that would diminish the quality of their life. So do you think this is going to stay a pursuit of the ultra-rich, or will everyone be able to live beyond 100 soon?
I mean, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I think since it's not even in recent years, it's very much since the dawn of time that the super wealthy, the kings and queens of old, have pursued immortality. They've gone for the fountain of youth. It is an allure, this allure of eternal life that I think has driven a lot of people mad over time. So it's very easy, I think, to dismiss the entire longevity industry as just a similar folly. I think it's good that we started with a conversation around what is happening in biotech and that confluence of that plus data storage plus AI to explain why things might be different this time. Because otherwise, as I say, if you're hearing that Jeff Bezos has invested $3 billion in Altos Labs and is trying to pursue longevity, you think, okay, well, it's just another crazy rich guy.
Yeah.
The thing with these people is that they're not inherently pursuing these treatments for themselves and only themselves. They are pursuing these investments in these companies that they think will net a large amount of revenue in future. I think that's probably the first step to consider, that they wouldn't be doing this in a public setting if they thought that this was going to remain purely for them. The question, of course, is what is the benefit to society of a longer living population? I think, unfortunately, we've allowed ourselves to develop a view of old age as being a burden on the population. We've allowed ourselves to consider that old people don't have anything left to contribute and are just weak and are a cost to the health system and everything like that. And I don't think that's necessarily a fair representation of what the elderly can contribute in terms of experience, in terms of storytelling and everything like that. And just in terms of actually general participation in the economy. The other aspect of this is I think people often think around lifespan as being the metric that we're looking at when we talk around longevity. So yes, it's often the word used because you can put a numerical value on that. You can say living to 100. Now, what state is this person at 100? People say, I don't want to live to 100 if I'm going to be, demented and in a wheelchair and everything like that. So what this industry is very much focused on is health span. So trying to keep people in as good health for as long as possible. And this brings me back to your question in terms of, is this going to remain the domain of the super wealthy? What is the biggest risk factor for an adverse outcome with COVID? It's age. What is the biggest risk factor for developing heart disease? Age. Most cancers, age. Diabetes, age. All of the money that we're spending on all of these serious illnesses, chronic illnesses, everything like that, there's a potential for governments to save, and insurers or whatever sort of funding model you're looking at for your health system, to save huge amounts of money if you can take age out of the equation. Now, obviously, it's not the sole thing. There's lifestyle aspects and things like that as well. But if you can slow the aging process, stop the aging process, or reverse the aging process, the economic benefits from that are huge. So it's unlikely that the first country to do something like this will be a major world power. But I would be looking very closely at countries like Singapore, Israel, these smaller populations that are very high tech, very comparatively wealthy, and especially when you look at a country like Singapore that has an aging population is already part of the problem that they're facing from a demographic point of view. In those sort of settings, it will make sense for governments to look at introducing longevity programs at a population level. And my understanding is that some of these governments are already considering this. It will be a big change for society because, I think of my own country, New Zealand, where the retirement age is 65. Whenever anyone suggests, in a political sense, changing the retirement age, they get shouted down by the masses. But the bulk of the welfare payments in New Zealand are for superannuation. The bulk of a disproportionate amount of New Zealand spending goes on welfare, which, as I say, is primarily superannuation. If you've got a significant proportion of the population living to 100, it starts becoming very economically unviable unless that superannuation becomes a means to some sort of universal basic income that the age comes down over time or something like that. But that would be a whole different conversation. But it may be that we are finding ourselves on the precipice of having to completely restructure the way that we look at society. And that, as I say, I think will come from a population level because of the amount of money that governments can save if they can take age out of the equation when it comes to health or other aspects as well. The disability support stuff, you take that out of the equation. You consider actually that, people who are 65 who feel age 30 are probably not going to retire. They're probably going to stay active in the economy for longer and everything like that. So there's huge potential advantages for governments for that. It is, I think, a question that people ask more. You extend it from the super rich to be, well, what about developing countries and everything like that? I feel personally that this may be one of those scenarios in which developing countries are able to adopt this technology as a leapfrog technology. So in the same way as a number of countries bypass putting in landlines of phones and went straight to mobile phones, that it may be, why construct an entire health system that manages chronic disease and big cancer care units and everything like that if you can just stop your population aging? It's a heaps easier option. Mm-hmm. So there's certainly scope for this to become a thing that ends up in the developing world widespread much sooner than it does in the Western world, with the other aspect of that, on a side note, being, of course, regulation, that may actually be easier in some of these countries.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So would you say, for a similar reason that a lot of countries went skipping 1G, 2G, 3G to straight to 4G, 5G, because that's when they have the money to invest in network resources. In a similar fashion, when a lot of new developing countries with a potentially high per capita income in the future get up to speed with current health tech, they're going to potentially be able to go straight from treating just diseases to potentially look at how to increase the age of their population.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is certainly plausible. And then the other aspect of that is, of course, if you're Nigeria, for example, or one of the more prosperous countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the possibility when you're looking at your population pyramid being heavily skewed towards the younger compared to many Western countries or other countries in, for example, Japan, where it's heavily skewed the other direction, that if you've got a young, healthy population to start with, you already don't need to be spending money on all of the oncology suites and cardiac cath labs and everything like that. So instead, you could immediately start spending money on age-reversal stuff for that younger population to keep it younger, so that you don't actually have to make those investments later. So I think there's certainly scope for these sort of technologies to actually permeate into the developing world a lot faster than what people realize.
Yeah. Besides genomics, I want to ask you, what technology do you think supports this longevity narrative the most? If I frame the question in another way, if somebody wishes to live 25% longer than the current average age, let's say around 75 to 80, so they want to take up their country's average age to over 100, what can they do right now? What can they invest in? Or what should they be investing in?
Okay, so I'd like to maybe approach this in a couple of different directions. So let's start with, if you want to increase the global life expectancy the most, how do you do that? You invest in basically maternity care. You want good quality maternity care available to everyone around the world. That means that you're less likely to have perinatal mortality, death of either the mother or of the baby. That in itself starts pushing up life expectancy pretty rapidly. Then you focus on childhood mortality, certain infectious diseases, so especially access to clean water, vaccination, everything like that. Once you deal to these basics around maternity care, clean water, vaccinations, treatment for infectious diseases, target things like malaria, that is where you're going to have the most rapid rise in life expectancy globally. Mm-hmm. So I think it's worth, focusing on that if you want to have this a global effect, that is where to do it, is in countries where people are not making it to age 5. Mm-hmm. If you want to do it from a more individual basis, well, the first thing I would recommend for an individual who wants to live a long time is to not die. It sounds silly, but the longer you stay alive, the more likely these technologies are to catch up with things. Right.
So the longer you play the game, the chances are that you're going to discover something in the future that will help you live even longer.
Yeah, and we even see this from an individual level, that your life expectancy actually increases each year that you age because you've survived another year and avoided dying in that year. Mm-hmm. There's a whole concept around the expected or predicted additional life years that people are getting depending on technology at the moment, and often what is sort of quoted is every year every 4 or 5 years you live at the moment, you probably gain another year in life from medical technologies as to what they will be when you reach that age. Now there's a guy, Aubrey de Grey, who's a somewhat controversial figure in the longevity sphere.
Aubrey
de Grey. Controversial for 2 reasons. One, some of the audacious claims that he makes, and secondly, there have been some allegations he's been dealing with on a more, questioning his professionalism kind of level. Okay. But about 10 years ago, he made a claim that the first person to live to 1,000 has already been born. And that's sort of what caught the headlines with him. Recently, he was asked, does he stand by that? And he said he regrets that statement because it set people's views too low of what's possible. So he talks of this concept of the Methuselarity, so like a singularity, but the Methuselarity where the point at which every year that you live is gaining you an additional year of life. And he puts the likelihood of that happening in the next 20 years at 50-50. As I say, he is a controversial figure. I would not be that optimistic on that myself from what I've seen. But it's worth mentioning that in terms of what some people are considering or talking about in this sphere in general. So when I say you want to live a long time, just don't die, what I'm meaning is that the technology is starting to catch up with a lot of this sort of stuff.
Yeah,
so
that then take a chance.
Yeah, so that then comes back to, well, what do you do now to stay in his best health for as long as possible?
Yeah.
So there's obvious things like don't smoke. You know,
is that the biggest?
I think it should go without saying, really, because, I mean, when people start questioning the whole plausibility of longevity science, what I would say is look at a smoker at age 35 compared to a non-smoker at age 35. Yeah. You can see that with one intervention, we can alter the aging process pretty dramatically. Physically, you can see it.
And for that person, can I just ask, does it make any difference if they're, eating a salad or, going to the gym, but at the same time smoking 5 cigarettes a day? Is it an obvious difference between the two?
See, it's difficult because you've put the limit at 5 cigarettes a day. Because this is the thing, this is how much smoking has changed even in like my medical career in the last 10 years. Is when I was in medical school, the measure of how much somebody smoked was the pack year. A pack a day for a year was 1 pack year. No one smokes a pack a day anymore. They're far too expensive. So the 5 cigarettes a day is now much more common in GP practice what you'll see a smoker smoking. At least in New Zealand or Australia where the tax is super high on cigarettes. The reality is that is going to have less of an effect in terms of causing lung cancer and everything like that. The carbon monoxide from the cigarette smoke does still mean that there is that high rates of heart disease and things too.
Yeah.
But no, it is very difficult to know exactly how much that can be offset.
Yeah.
If you are living in a major city and you're breathing in a lot of pollution, everything like that, that is equivalent to smoking a certain amount. We don't know exactly. Yeah. But yeah, you wouldn't say that someone living in a city should just give up on diet and exercise entirely because of what they're breathing in. Yeah. So in the same way, I say if you're a smoker, you can't kick it, or you just have put a huge amount of value in it, something that you really like, you understand that there's risks around it, then don't give up on everything. You can still focus on the other lifestyle aspects as well. I would still recommend giving it the boot, but that's sort of what I'd say with that. So I mean, the smoking thing, as I say, is the obvious one. It's not going to be popular with MBAs, but alcohol consumption is not a good thing either, unfortunately. Sleep, critically important. Again, not something you really want to tell MBAs, especially who are going to go off and work for big consulting firms and things like that. But every MBA should read a book called Why We Sleep by Dr. Matthew Walker, explaining the importance of sleep, the effect that we're seeing over the last 100 years of changes in urban environments affecting sleep, the fact we're sleeping less, the fact that you can see perfectly overlying, obviously correlation is not causation, but certainly a strong correlation between decreasing average sleep and the obesity epidemic, for example. It's having a marked effect. So you really want to focus on sleep, avoid smoking, avoid drinking too much. Plant-based whole foods diet appears to be the best option for longevity. Again, there's difficulties around how you determine causality with this, but when you look at the blue zones, and these are the zones around the world and numerous different ethnic backgrounds, so places like Okinawa, and then also places like in the Mediterranean and stuff as well, where people have these disproportionately high number of centenarians. They follow a diet that is predominantly plant-based, maybe supplemented with a little bit of fish or animal meat at some stage. When you look at other sort of observational studies are suggesting, I saw a claim the other day that said that vegans live 15 years longer than on average. I think that's probably a bit excessive, especially with the vegan junk food and things that are out there at the moment. But as far as we can tell at this stage, plant-based diet appears to be the best for longevity. So primarily, don't do things that are going to cause you problems later. Maintaining a healthy weight, it's not politically correct to say, but the science is very definitive on this, and I'll say it's very much not people's fault if they're overweight most of the time, as we live in a very obesogenic environment. I mentioned the sleep aspect before. That's light pollution in the cities causing that.
Yeah.
Air pollution also contributes to high cortisol levels, which is leading to people becoming more obese. So there's a whole environmental aspect of things that are causing this, but having a high BMI, large waist circumference, is not good for your longevity. So things like this that if you focus on now, don't develop those chronic diseases. That is probably the best advice going forward for an individual. And then wait and see where the technology brings us.
You're talking about class 1 carcinogens. These are confirmed carcinogens in humans. Alcohol, tobacco, lack of sleep, all of these are proven to be carcinogenic. Yeah, red meat as well. So basically avoid carcinogens, is that what you're saying?
Well, avoid the onset of chronic disease. So there's a guy who is also quite active in the longevity sphere called Dr. Peter Attia. He's originally a general surgeon by training, but now runs a clinic that's more focused on longevity. He has a podcast called The Drive. It gets a bit technical at times, I think, maybe for the layperson, but it's well worth having a look at if you're interested in this sort of sphere. He very much quotes the studies that suggest that when you look at centenarians and things like that, when they do end up dying, when they develop a chronic disease, they die as quickly from their chronic disease as anyone else does. So the thing that's making them live a long time is the absence of a chronic disease.
Yeah.
You can delay the onset of chronic disease as long as possible. That is what is best for your health long term, basically. So yes, avoid the carcinogens, but also avoid the things that are going to give you heart disease or diabetes or any other chronic disease. Yeah. What I think needs to be invested in most at this stage is aging clocks, so actual measures of biological age. Chronological age is irrelevant.
It's just a number.
It's just a number. Increasingly we're seeing that as increasingly we're getting more and more super healthy 60, 70-year-olds who are healthier than some 30-year-olds kind of thing. We need to be able to adequately measure biological age to know what these interventions that we're doing actually, what effect they're actually having, kind of thing.
And can we do that today?
Well, we have numerous measures that we can try to do that with. So one of the commonly one done, I mentioned methylation clocks earlier. So that's the Horvath clock, named after Steve Horvath, who's another researcher in the longevity sphere, which shows that you can predict with pretty good accuracy looking at someone's methylation profile, what their age is, and that variation one side or another tends to actually show what their biological age is.
Right.
The problem with this is it can be messed with, and it can be messed with in a very simple way. Increasingly, we're starting to understand that, as is often the case, that ancient wisdom might sometimes be built on some, scientific understanding that we've lost over time, but most cultures have had some sort of aspect of fasting as part of either religious rites or whatever sort of thing. We're seeing increasingly that fasts are probably a beneficial thing, be that an intermittent fast or a longer fast, 5 days, 1 week. If you're going to try 1 week, do it with some supervision, I would say. But if somebody fasts for 5 days, they will reverse a lot of the methylation on their DNA. Now, have they actually in 5 days reversed their biological age? Probably not, right? This is the problem with these measures, is that they can be messed with and things like that. But there are other measures. There are various blood age clocks where they're looking at a number of markers within the blood. Not just is it in the normal range or not, but where it sits in the normal range. There are markers around the microbiome. There are even markers around psychological, how you approach certain questions and things like that suggests what your psychological age is. So there's all sorts of stuff happening with that. Until we get to a point where we can adequately say, you are this years old biologically and this years old chronologically, any of the interventions we might want to test, be this pharmacological interventions, be this lifestyle interventions, or maybe gene therapy sort of interventions, until we can adequately measure age, it's very difficult for us to do studies because we don't want to be waiting 20 years for the results of a study into this sort of stuff. It's something that people will want to find a bit more rapidly.
I think some insurance companies do try to predict an age, or at least they predict a number based on your personal information that you give them, and they come up with a metric that can convert that into supposedly a biological age. So it looks like we made a start potentially towards that direction, but it's just that the data that I think these companies use to inform that figure are probably not of any scientific accuracy at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, so increasingly there is scientific accuracy starting to support some of the things that are going on, and a lot of that is being driven by AI. Again, it's the big data approach to health, and in time, I mean, I'm aware of some of the companies. There's one that's based out of Hong Kong called Deep Longevity. That is certainly interested in the insurance market, and I think the insurance market's interested in them as well, because of where they're at with being able to predict biological age. And I think, you're quite right that these are applications that this sort of technology has in the near future.
So I want to shift the focus a little bit now to what's happening today with education and startups, especially. Assuming that lots of innovation tend to come from young people who are, energetic and entrepreneurial, and lots of people are studying medicine, biotechnology, and healthcare today. Why don't we see so many cool or sexy biotech startups in the news on a daily basis as we do tech companies?
Interesting. So I feel like there probably is a lot happening that people are not aware of, is what I'd say first. I do think that the rate at which these startups are happening is probably increasing. I don't actually have the data to support that, but my feeling is that what is happening is all these technologies we've been talking about that were inaccessible 20 years ago are now very much reality and can be being used in many countries around the world.
Yeah.
On top of that, though, I think there's the underlying, I want to say issue, but it's maybe not quite the right word, because I mean, I think, regulation is, of course, critically important when you're dealing with healthcare, because you don't want to be making false claims about things. You also don't want to be harming people. It's the critical tenet of the profession is first do no harm, right? So I don't want to call regulation a problem as such, but because it is such a regulated environment, because, if you're trying to start a medical device company, if you don't get FDA approval, what's the point? It's sort of, you're very much reliant on that that step in the process, and this takes time. Because all drug development ends up going through drug companies as well, it does potentially make it more difficult to get things going for the smaller players.
Right.
Of course, there are technologies that are coming up, things like AI, but even just simple app-based approaches to health that have allowed more people to get started from a startup point of view in healthcare. The question really, as you sort of allude to, is the problem that people are maybe not actually as interested in healthcare and biotech as you and I am. And I do wonder whether that's the case. I think people got really interested in the pandemic when everyone learnt what an R0 was, and everyone became an epidemiologist and had some comment to make and everything like that.
The fact that it took a pandemic and relatives dying to get people interested in something. And I'm still skeptical whether there is long-term lasting interest among the public in this area, or is it just the result of, well, we need to do something right now, let me read some study papers around Dumas' work, and then next year they stop caring about it completely again.
I think it's a society very fascinated by celebrity and things like that, and perhaps neglect the people who are actually having more lasting impacts on the world. I think we'll have to see what happens after the pandemic. I'm optimistic that life will have changed enough of an extent that things may reorient in a different direction. But actually, I was speaking to the dean this morning about this, that we were talking about telemedicine, and my concern being that the experience we had in New Zealand after the first lockdown was, after thinking telemedicine was so amazing, it was going to be the future for how we deliver care in rural health in New Zealand. Within days, people went back to the status quo of doing everything face-to-face. And I share your concerns that after the pandemic, people will go from thinking science is super interesting and health tech is like the way forward and everything like that, to it going back to the back page.
Back to TikTok. Where do you think you can have the greatest impact if you had unlimited resources? Let's say you have like multiple investors who are all willing to give you as much money as you want. What route would you go down?
So if I could do anything I wanted after the MBA. So
Not for yourself.
Well, I'm going to build a yacht. No. If I could do anything I wanted after the MBA, this is something I've thought about for years, actually, since probably the advent of me even considering doing the MBA. I would like to design the health system for Mars.
Okay, that's interesting.
Because I like health system design. I'm really interested in how we can approach that in a better way, how funding models can drive a more primary care focused and preventative healthcare approach. And I think that because of the status quo, it's very difficult to start those sort of things without starting from scratch.
Yeah.
And then that ties also in with the longevity aspect as well.
Mm-hmm.
In that, and this is perhaps what maybe I should have mentioned earlier in terms of one of the drivers behind this industry, is that if you think what prolonged space travel does, you've got this increased exposure to radiation. The decreased gravity means you get bone thinning, you get muscle loss and everything as well. These are some of the signs of aging.
Yeah.
Prolonged space travel appears to just accelerate aging. And if we look at the Apollo astronauts, they had something like 4 times the rate of heart disease than astronauts that did not leave, sort of the Earth orbit.
Yeah.
So there's,
and that's going to the moon.
And that's going to the moon for like a couple of days.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Yeah,
that sounds worrying.
It's a problem. It's a problem, and it's a problem that I'm aware that space agencies are working on. How do we?
It's not one that's talked about a lot.
It's not one that's talked about a lot. No, but the reality is that if you can't slow, stop, or reverse the aging process, it's going to be very difficult to colonize other planets. With our current technology. So in a way, we talk around how we need to have these good markers of aging so that we can do these proper studies around longevity and everything like that. Actually, putting a moon base up or a Mars base or something like that also becomes a test environment for all these technologies as well, because it's going to be a rapidly accelerated process. There would be other potentials for technological advances that would come from these environments as well, from a healthcare sector. So, for example, we know about the hygiene theorem. So we used to call it the hygiene hypothesis. Now they've moved up to theorem because they're that certain of it. And this is basically that living in sterile environments, not testing the immune system, increases the risk of autoimmune conditions and allergies and things like that. So we know, for example, if you grow up on a farm, you're less likely to develop these conditions. We know that if you have a dog in the home, you're less likely to develop these conditions. We know that if you have a dishwashing machine, you're more likely to develop the conditions because the dishwasher's too good at cleaning your plates and stuff.
Right.
So what happens then if you put people in a completely sterile environment where the only microbes are the ones they brought with them on their skin, that there's no infectious diseases coming because they've got a 9-month quarantine from Earth.
So they might never be able to come back to Earth. It might be a one-way ride immunologically for them.
Well, and I think it may be something that's manageable, but I would suspect it's manageable in the same way as we can give allergen shots to desensitize people against certain allergens, grass pollens, and things like that. We may need to have a similar process of kind of almost immunizing people against Earth so that they're able to return from Mars. But if in doing that you're able to prevent people on Mars from developing autoimmune conditions and allergic conditions, then you've created the way to also prevent people on Earth from developing that.
That's interesting.
So it goes both ways, and this is what I find interesting around it as a concept. And the other aspect is, of course, if you're starting from scratch with a health system, there's all sorts of interesting approaches you can take with this, right? So, like, if we think around, we talked earlier about some of the negatives of vices like smoking and drinking, all that sort of stuff. The reality is, though, every society loves a vice. Every society has some vice that it gets into. Even, so Mormons in the United States who don't even consume caffeine have some of the highest rates of prescription drug abuse. Everyone loves an intoxicant, and that's just part of human nature. This sort of part of consciousness is this desire to alter our
and that's for the dopamine rush, is it?
I don't think we know exactly what it is that drives humans to do that. I mean, obviously it's not unique to humans. Elephants eat fermented fruit to get pissed as well. So clearly it's just an aspect of being more conscious, I think. But that would mean, I think, that you need to start considering what the intoxicant is that you supply on a Mars colony. And I think that becomes a whole interesting thing as well, because if you're starting fresh, do you introduce alcohol into an environment that we know that alcohol is probably one of the more harmful drugs?
Yeah.
If we look at the least harmful drugs, then something like LSD, on all the drug harm indexes comes up as one of the least harmful. And there may be potential therapeutic advantages for hallucinogens from a mental health perspective. All sorts of things regarding that are worth considering on a completely different conversation. But if you're looking at something that you can transit in a form that is potent to take to Mars, it's the least possible weight, everything like that, that is also not a harmful drug at all, LSD might be what you'd actually choose as the intoxicant to sell in regulated shops in Mars. So maybe that's the future, is everyone's taking acid trips on Mars. I mean, I think David Bowie, it's a great shame that he did not live to see that.
I didn't expect you to say that. I think muffins last a long time as well, but if you want to go straight to LSD. I think I'm going to have to classify this one as explicit because of that conversation. So I guess it would be more important for us to give a controlled environment for them to take whatever they're going to end up taking rather than, just be surprised by something that we shouldn't be surprised by and then face the consequences later on.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've seen it time and again. If you put people into an environment, they're going to, it was depicted in that movie The Martian. He starts crushing up Vicodin to eat with his potatoes. This is what people are going to do, So what soldiers did in Afghanistan. If they couldn't get hold of other sort of drugs, they were taking the sort of the painkiller meds from the medics and things like that. It's part of human nature. People are going to do it, especially if they're isolated and taken a long way away from Earth. It seems a bit strange to sort of make this leap, but when you're working in a super yacht environment, you need to provide the highest level of healthcare to an incredibly wealthy person
in a concentrated space.
In a concentrated space, space is the problem. It's not money, right?
Yes.
It's what do we actually need? What is going to allow us to do the most
to a
stuff?
degree, weight as well, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And that then has led me into thinking around, if you're going to make a compact hospital in a container that you could deliver to a remote Pacific island, what would you actually put in there, and how would you be able to using internet stuff to be able to do the various procedures and things from different sides of the world and stuff like that. You think around all those aspects, that actually starts relating into what would you actually deploy to Mars to start with.
Interesting how creating a new infrastructure on Mars might end up improving conditions on Earth where we actually need that right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what people sometimes neglect when it comes to space exploration, is that there are many things that have come from space exploration that we now use as day-to-day normal things that we wouldn't think twice about. And while it may not always be obvious what the benefits of these sort of things are, there will be benefits.
Why don't we just look at the countries where they have a system that works and use that model around the world?
Because I don't think that anyone has got the health system right entirely. So I think that's the first point, is I don't think I've seen a system that I think is the perfect system and that everyone should emulate. And the reason for that is a couple of things. So firstly, it is important, I think, for us to consider how health systems are funded as the first step. And the reality is that, as I think we're both aware, the United States method of funding health is not working. It's not working for the people there, but more importantly, I think it's not working for the people who are funding it. It's not working for the government there. The life expectancy in a country like New Zealand or Australia, similar countries, is higher than in the United States, despite spending half the amount per capita on health. Government spending. I'm not talking about additional private spending on top of that.
Right.
So these sort of funding models that we see in the United States is not an efficient way to do this at all. So you're looking at sort of a single payer system being what has been demonstrated internationally as the most effective way of doing that. But then we have countries like New Zealand, Australia, UK, Canada, all these countries that have some variation of an NHS sort of model, where it's demonstrating that in itself is not necessarily the perfect way of doing things, and that it may be necessary to separate the funder from the actual service provider. Because when it's the same thing, it doesn't necessarily lead to efficient provision of care. And certainly I've seen that in GP clinics in New Zealand that are private organisations, very efficient, trying to get every bit of funding that they can get, versus ones that are owned by the local health boards, very inefficient. They have no intention to try and get the additional funding, meaning that on health targets, they fall very far behind because they have no incentive. So I think we can utilise a market approach to healthcare in terms of the provision of healthcare, but I still think you need that, and this is almost sounding like I'm quoting from our organisations versus markets lecture last term, but you need to have some degree of central planning, both from a funding point of view, but also to set what the goals and the targets are that you want the health system to achieve. There needs to be flexibility with those. There needs to be science-driven, evidence-based, and they do need to move because of the invariability that when you set targets, you create unintended consequences as well. Step 2 would be we need to completely turn the approach to healthcare on its head to be more focused around primary care and prevention. So there's a couple of statistics that I like around this. One is, and I assume it's the case in the UK as well, but 90% of the health budget is spent in hospitals to do 10% of the work, whereas 10% of the health budget is spent in GP clinics to do 90% of the work. Maybe we need to adjust how we do that if we want to actually have effective primary healthcare, effective prevention, and everything like that. Because it's well established by the WHO and other organisations that the more hospital specialists you have in comparison to GPs, the worse the health outcomes for the population. Too many specialists is a bad thing. You need more GPs. GPs are approaching things with more general oversight. This is not just my personal bias. People can Google this. It is in the literature that this is true. Question is, how do you get more GPs? Because every country around the world that has a primary care focused health system or has GPs as gatekeepers is struggling to have sufficient staff. You've got Australia and New Zealand lacking GPs, UK lacking GPs. Every country is lacking GPs at the moment, and then countries that are looking to move into that primary care focused approach. So, for example, Abu Dhabi has announced that that's the direction that they want to go as well. Where are they going to suddenly get all these GPs from? They're probably going to try and recruit them from other countries that already have those sort of systems. The issue we have at the moment is that because there are insufficient GPs, they are under a high level of pressure. The patients are not necessarily all that happy or grateful to see them. Don't often have a huge amount of respect for them because of the fact they can't do their jobs properly because they're so pressured to get through the workloads they have to get through. There's such long waiting times to get to them that people have saved up all of these things, which mean that none of those problems get dealt to adequately. And then on top of that, the profession is not really that valued by others within the wider medical sector. So sort of GPs are potentially not well enough remunerated. And I think unless you fix the fact that nobody really wants to be a GP, you're not going to be able to fix the whole health system regarding that.
And if you can't fix that, would you just replace that system with AI?
Well, this is the difficulty, I think, is that if you're looking for, let's create an algorithm, for example, that triages nephrology referrals, so kidney referrals, advises what additional tests need to be done, advises the most likely diagnosis, or recommends a particular treatment. That is something that's relatively, and I'm probably going to inflame specialists by saying this, but it's relatively straightforward to put together diagnostic pathways and approaches and things like that, and treatment protocols. Because effectively you're dealing with a differentiated patient. And this is the thing that hospital doctors often neglect, is that if you're not an emergency department doctor, if you're not an urgent care doctor, if you're not a primary care doctor, then the majority of patients you see are differentiated. You know what the diagnosis is already. If you don't know what the diagnosis is, you've got a good idea that it's one of a couple of sort of things. It's very unusual that an undifferentiated patient makes it to specialist level care. And as a GP, I can say for certainty, if you try and refer a completely undifferentiated patient into hospital, it's not going to happen. Like that referral is going to get turned down. So
just for the audience, sorry, Alastair, differentiation means what category of healthcare that patient needs to go under?
It's effectively, does this patient have a diagnosis? When that patient walks into the GP clinic, you don't know what the thing that they've come in with, what the problem is, anything about that person necessarily. that is undifferentiated. For example, let's say that we'll use the emergency department example because I don't want to fully focus on GPs here and make them out to be superhuman, which of course they are. But let's say someone presents to the hospital with chest pain. By the time the emergency department has referred that person to cardiology with their suspected heart attack, they've already done enough tests to prove that this person is having a heart attack, and cardiology takes things from there and manages it on a set protocol that's well established and everything like that. They've got particular specialist interventions that they can offer that the emergency department can't offer, cath labs and things like that, but the bulk of the diagnostics has already been done. When the patient's handed over to the specialist knows what the problem is at that point. And that's what we mean by differentiated versus undifferentiated. So the question is, if you're dealing with a completely undifferentiated patient, yes, the bulk of what GPs deal with is very simple, minor medical problems. But to train AI to be able to deal with that undifferentiated patient is much harder than it is to do it in the hospital setting. So firstly, you've got that aspect. The second aspect is the money aspect. If you're a healthcare system planner and you can create some system that automates away a cardiologist that you're having to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds a year to do cardiology stuff versus automates away a GP that you're paying £100,000 a year, which of the two are you going to choose? You go for the specialist level stuff because it's so much more expensive, and this comes back to the whole 90% of the money is spent in hospital. That is where a lot of the innovation is focused because, you're quite right. A technology approach to primary healthcare may alleviate some of those burdens, take away the tasks that are tedious and menial and wasting GPs' time that they could actually better spend with longer appointments with more complicated patients and things like that. The problem is, as I say, the complexity of dealing with an undifferentiated patient, and then on top of that, where the money is coming from for an already underfunded sector. Yeah.
So I want to make it more casual now, and I've got a couple of final questions for you. What has been your most unusual but memorable experience this year so far in the MBA?
When I was weighing up between the various MBA options, I applied to the one-year programs, Cambridge, Oxford, INSEAD, got all three, turned down INSEAD on the fact that it wasn't one of these bigger campuses with other sort of stuff going on, right? So I wanted that wider university experience. So I think for that reason I want to mention some of the aspects of that wider university experience because I think that's what's really that's what makes the MBA particularly interesting. So one of the things that I've really enjoyed in the first term was some of the talks happening at the Cambridge Union and the caliber of speakers that they're able to attract to that space.
For example, Stephen Fry.
Stephen Fry was amazing, so good. That was probably one of my favorites. But there's someone like Katalin Karikó, the inventor of the mRNA vaccines, telling her life story. It's just like arguably the most important scientific figure of certainly the last 3 years. But we'll see how history remembers her. But it may well be one of the most important scientific figures of the 21st century, and she's there, 5 meters away from you, addressing the audience. It's crazy. There was one talk I went to just before our exams that was a bit undersubscribed. I think a lot of people had left Cambridge at that stage, but it was Darren Brown, the illusionist. So for those people who haven't seen his work, he very much takes a science or like a fact-based approach to what he's doing, that he's not doing any magic or trickery, that it's working on various psychological methods that can get people to do what he wants to do. And whether you sort of believe in hypnotism or however it's working, he is able to get people to do things that otherwise they wouldn't. He has a number of great shows that he's done on they're available on Netflix or on YouTube and things as well. And he gave this talk where he's talking around his life and everything like that. It wasn't so much a demonstration of his skills, and at the end took some questions from the audience. And there was one question, it was from an engineer at the back, who asked him, okay, if we accept what you're saying, that there's no magic in anything you're doing, that these are set techniques that can be learned by any person that can do these sort of things like that. The guy's like, I'm an engineer, I work in AI and machine learning. What does this mean? Because if these are techniques that a human can learn, a machine can learn them as well. And if a machine can manipulate us in the way that you're able to manipulate us, what does that mean for the future of humanity? And it was that moment where his face just dropped. He had.
He didn't expect that.
He did not expect that. He sort of stuttered a bit, and then just was like, I've never been asked that question before. You could just see this moment of terror on his face when he recognised the threat of what this could bring.
That sounds terrifying.
Terrifying, but also super interesting to see someone caught on the spot like that. And so candidly, that this is a guy who's performed to these sold-out shows around the world, well-known figure. To be caught on the spot by some question like that, to see this really genuine reaction of kind of, oh shit.
Yeah.
And he kind of, I guess, has fudged this answer around how he thinks there's this human element that he's not sure that can be replicated, and I think he didn't persuade himself on that, let alone didn't persuade others in the room. Yeah. But it's that sort of experience that you can't get outside an environment like this, the access to these people. And these candid conversations with them. I think that for me has been the sort of really exciting aspect of the MBA.
And if you could give one piece of advice for aspiring MBAs, particularly for people in the bioscience industry looking to do an MBA, what would that advice be?
My advice, I think, is quite simple, actually. Go onto the GMAT website and book your GMAT test. Book it, 3 months, 6 months in advance. Just book it, and then you've got something to work towards. Maybe your first GMAT you don't get as good a score as you want. That's fine. You can do it again. But once you've booked it, you've started that process. Everything else can follow after that. We talked around how you've got this 5-year window, right? Book the test. If you've got any inkling to do an MBA, get the process started. It's no major commitment to you. That would be my advice to people. Is you can spend so much time thinking around, is this the right thing for me to do? Do I have the right stuff on my CV? Are they going to accept me? It's like, until you've done the GMAT test, none of that is relevant. Like, it's sort of do the GMAT test, then you can focus on your CV. You can do your extracurriculars or whatever. The other aspect I would recommend that I think has been pretty defining for my career was soon after medical school, when I started kind of considering, do I want to go in different directions and things, was getting involved with sort of the various student or trainee panels with both either the Medical Association or the GP College. Find roles that you can do within your professional organizations, because there are always leadership positions in these. Often they're being elected unopposed and things like that. It will expose you to a lot. It will give you additional connections. Looks good on applications for things like this. And ultimately, I don't think you're going to regret doing those sort of things, even if it doesn't lead you down the MBA route. So those are the two recommendations I'd have: is make sure you're stepping outside of the purely clinical stuff, and then just do the bloody GMAT.
Yes. Alastair, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was a lovely experience for me, and I'm sure it was for a lot of the other people that are going to listen to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great.
Cheers.